Let us now move on to the first panel discussion. Our first panel discussion will be Financing while Preserving the Environment, which will be moderated by Dr. Wit Sittibekin, an experienced and well-known news anchor. For this session, we are honored to have with us 4 distinguished panelists, whom I would now like to invite on stage. Mr. Bantun Lamsam, Chairman of the Board and CEO of Kasikorn Bank, Mr. Simon Tay, Chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, Mr. Vivek Pathak, Director of the International Financial Corporation, East Asia and the Pacific, Mr. Roger Charles, Director of Environmental and Social Risk Management at Standard Chartered Bank. Thank you.
Well, good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and of course, members of the press and our honorable speakers on the stage this morning. Good morning and Sawadee Krab. Well, 75 minutes from now, we'll be hearing authentic voices from our honorable panelists upon the issues that is our collective responsibility. Financing while preserving environment. Of course, these issues, many people would have think, well, these two finance and environmental issues seems to be rather far apart, but how financial institutions as well as the financial organizations are helping in preserving the environment. The first 60 minutes will be our panel discussions, and afterwards we'll spare another 15 minutes for questions and answers from the panelists on the stage here. And therefore, should there be any kind of questions, you can either hold up the microphones at the end of the panel discussions, or else write down your questions in a little piece of paper, and of course in a readable manner, to ensure that we'll address that upon the stage here. Well, when people talk about banking and preserving environment, everything in the 21st century, we always have the same starting point, inspiration. And I wish to ask Kun Bantun, who is the chairman of the board and the CEO of Kasikorn Bank, to share with us what inspired you personally as well as Kasikorn Bank to be the bank who assumed the responsibility and who embraced sustainability and preserve environment.
The term sustainability is a very noble concept, but it can be very slippery in this interpretation and application. The Thai banking system, Thailand as a country, woke up to this concept way back in 1997, the financial crisis, which actually the banking system essentially went bankrupt. And that's a real negative impact for the first time across the entire population, more so for the people at the bottom rung of the society. So after that major cataclysmic event, I think Thailand and Bank of Thailand in particular, became very stringent on how we go about running risk management at the banks. At that time, it was about the risk about lending. Prior to 1997, there was a whole no holds bar kind of lending by the banking system, because people interpreted the market was moving only one way. And it did until the end came in a very spectacular disaster. So afterwards, the Bank of Thailand as a regulator and the bank boards in general have been very cautious about how we go about lending. But people tend to forget the past very quickly, especially when you pressed by the pressure to perform financially in the stock market. So people are back lending, to quote my late father's comment, in a very acrobatic manner, acrobatic lending. So at what point is that not acceptable? We don't know. You don't know when you fall over the cliff and you get there, because when the people warn you you're moving towards the cliff, you don't listen, because there's pressure to perform, and that is something that is the regulator have to be on top, and to be able to gauge what risk is being taken in the system, in the banking system. Once you get to that point, that something falls over, then it's a very ugly scene. We certainly don't want to see that again. So the bank boards in general have been apprehensive, but again, the new generation of bankers will come around and the old generation will fade away and they will forget that what happened 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And there's always an argument that we know better now how to manage risk. I incline not to believe that. If you take too much risk, something's going to blow up. So that's something that is now in the mind of the regulators and the bank boards in general. But it's something that is always an issue of when you apply the brake and by whom. First, of course, I believe the Bank of Thailand has that primary responsibility to make sure that the system does not get out of hands in terms of risk-taking. On top of that, now we're going into a different kind of risk-taking in terms of the concentration risk. Actually, as we bemoan every day the gap in wealth in the society in Thailand in particular, if you look at the way the banks behave in the day-to-day kind of lending, actually we lend more to the people at the upper end of the economic class than the people down below. Because of the credit worthiness is easy to ascertain. And that is creeping in again. And when there's a limit of 25% of the bank's capital, you can lend a single conglomerate. I mean, given the size of the banks these days, that's a huge amount of money. And you can see that people are pushing that limits now. Even sometimes coming into the Bank of Thailand to ask for some temporarily stay on that limits to lend. For me, this is extremely unsustainable in two senses. One is something goes wrong, and things can always go wrong. You tip over the whole banking system because some large borrowers go bankrupt or something like that. Secondly, from the equity in the social sense, this is extremely unacceptable. For the banking system to collect deposits from small people, retail investor, and put the credit money on a silver platter to the top conglomerates, for me is both immoral and obscene. And only the Bank of Thailand can put a stay to that. As a participant in the banking system, one single bank cannot do that. Otherwise, you lose out to the competitors. So if you think 25% is too much, put a lid on that now. I think it's important for Bank of Thailand to own up to that, and that is one way to to address the issue of the income gap or the wealth gap. I mean, the top conglomerates, they have all the technology, all the know-how, and they have access to capital. They shouldn't have to come to the banks all the time. They have to go to the capital markets and face the music and raise the money themselves. And you allow the people down there to access money. People at the bottom rungs, they cannot access credit these days because of credit worthiness. So it's something that is an issue of a higher level of sustainability, and making sure that people across the strata of the society get access to reasonable credit so that they can do their work there. Just to touch on a little bit before I leave my time here about environment, we're now talking about lending to support the environment. And it sounds very noble indeed, I say it. But it's difficult to interpret. For example, you want to lend to clean energy, you want to lend to clean water. Take a dam project. This is a big dam project. And these days, when you want to build a dam, and worse, to finance building of a dam, you can be ready for some damnation because they'll come after you. This huge dam is not even in Thailand, it's in Laos. There's an agreement between the Thai government, the Laos governments, the Thai banks participate in a full manner. And we think we have gone through all the steps of environmental analysis, but still people would disagree. And people will always disagree. And when they come after the bankers. They come after us in the shareholders meeting. Why do you lend to this? Why do you lend to this? This is a government project. Why don't you talk to the prime minister or so? And they say they won't allow him to see him. so they come after the bankers. So it's something that is very tricky. That now I think the government and the regulators will have to give a guidance on how much you expect the banks to go into this kind of thing. We think they've done the project is well managed in terms of the impact on the environment, but people will always disagree, and they will come after the bankers. So I will have another example of lending of financial institutions participating in the preservation of environment, but my second round, please.
Well, thank you very much, Kun Bantun, for having shared the account very straightforward manner. And anyway, now I wish to ask questions to the chairman of Singapore Institute of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Simon Tay, from a policy-making point of view. What kind of approach that you take, how to link financing together with the attempt to preserve environment?
Well, thank you very much for asking me, and I want to thank Kun Virathai and the Bank of Thailand for inviting us come from Singapore to share some policy perspective from Singapore. As I begin, I want to first thank Kun Banton for his comments. I think it's very important to see this not only as an environmental issue, noble as he says, but a risk issue and an equity issue, which Kun Virathai also emphasized in his talk about his initial remarks. When we see this risk and over-concentration or inequality issue, then we bring this issue into the center of banking rather than just purely on sort of one nice but perhaps neglected wing. I've got some comments and slides to share with you, if I can get this thing to move. But where do I click? Okay, good. We feel that the time has come to talk about sustainable development and the financial sector to bring these two different parts together. Firstly, because of global trends. As the Paris Agreement on climate change is moving ahead, we observe that many countries are shifting their growth strategies to become more green. And this is not just, of course, the Europeans especially, and Americans, but also here in our region, China, India. I think in terms of their solar power, their wind power, they have really made very significant steps in the last 10 years. And they've changed the discussion. I'm not saying they're angels, but they have changed the way they are thinking and participating in the challenge of a green growth. So I think it has become now a political and market reality that there can be stranded assets, that things we do today will not make sense in a few years' time. I often joke that my late father used to smoke cigarettes. I'm sure many people did or still do. And now when you look at the medical science, it seems crazy. But when you think back to where it was, it didn't seem so stupid. So I asked myself, what are we doing today that may seem as stupid as cigarette smoking? And I apologize to smokers here, or anybody who owns a tobacco company. But that's the question I come to when we think about the sustainability and looking forward into the future. And so I think when we apply that question, the climate, carbon may be a bit like smoking, like the whole country smoking carbon rather than a cigarette. And so we are seeing a strong movement in the West, and global finance obviously does have a strong bearing what they do. In our region, as I mentioned, China during this G20 year really talked about its own 5-year plan to move forward and really change the way it does things. And it will affect us quite directly. As China moves out into the region to offer its BRI, there are many controversies. But one of the package of responses to the controversy about the Belt and Road Initiative will be to bring in the environmental, social, and governance issues. And if they can do that, and if they kind of have to do that, they will be much more acceptable and sustainable in the long term. And so in China itself, they have now 5 pilot zones in Guangdong, and 4 others I can't pronounce, and really are making a fight against pollution. And really, they're spending about $440 billion US dollar, not renminbi, US dollar, a year. And I think when you see the pollution in China, you understand why the leadership from the very top to the financial sector, to the corporate sector, is now making this shift. And also see why they're buying houses in Chiang Mai, because it's so polluted in China, they'd rather live in Thailand. In our region too, you see Indonesia starting to take steps, and really the OJK there has produced a sustainable finance roadmap. It's now coming into their planning, the Ministry of Finance and their Ministry of Forecasting, Planning, so that really they're starting to sell bonds and make efforts so that the infrastructure they're building under President Jokowi will be a greener infrastructure. Last but not least in our region is Malaysia, is really, if you count Sukuk, the Islamic finance, has become the largest sustainable and responsible investment SRI market in Asia, outside of Japan, and the second largest Islamic fund globally. And I think this is significant for Malaysia, my nearest neighbor. For Singapore itself, really our motivations is to respond to this global and regional shift, but often there is a personal or local reason. In our case, was the transboundary haze pollution that we suffer from fires in Indonesia. I mentioned how China has its own problems, and I think Kun Viratai in his keynote speech mentioned how Thailand has faced its own domestic challenges. I think this is very important. There's both the global factor for policy change, but the kind of local factor. And I think these two come together to really make that movement both something that is for the planet, but for the local communities. I think the local gain is very important to emphasize. Of course, for Singapore, together with Bangkok and others, we try to be a financial hub for the region. And we understand that there are not only cautions and costs, but there are great opportunities. As our region grows, all of us are doing quite well. As our region builds infrastructure, the ability to do this, finance this in a sustainable way, I think is the great opportunity for all of us. I have only a few minutes at the start, and we'll come back to more discussion. But I just want to start by saying a little bit about what my small country, Singapore, has begun to do. I want to make it clear that we are also at the start of this journey. I mentioned how the Europeans, I think, are further ahead, and we are not at all sort of the leader on this trend. But we have started modestly. This year, our Singapore exchange, the stock exchange, will have mandatory sustainable reporting on a comply or explain basis. And this will raise a kind of a baseline for people to understand how listed companies are processing environmental, sustainability, social and governance issue, ESG, in its full complex. And really, I think this is a very positive step, but it's not been taken that well. Frankly, many boards and companies see this as just another nuisance, tick-the-box exercise. We have, in a way, to also create the financial incentives, the funds, etc., that will create the pull factor, not just a regulator to push them, but the incentive to entice them to make this step, to see a benefit. The second step, therefore, is in the early examples of green bond issuance. Some are purely private plays. City developments, large property developer, have retrofitted a number of its buildings to the highest possible energy efficiency. This is really energy saving, climate saving, but also cost saving, which pays back the bond. So it makes sense in many ways. Additionally, our Government Investment Corporation and Temasek are both starting to look at green investments, either on their own, not yet, but alongside more seasoned funds from the West, so to create that pull factor. And the third, of course, is that in a simple way, our central bank, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, has created a simple scheme called the Green Bond Grant Scheme. It does take more time. It does take more money and some advisors to help companies issue green bonds, to have them really certified and go through a process to make sure they are, in fact, meeting ESG. Why should an issuer pay those costs? So though the number is not large, so long as a bond is above a certain size, I think 200 million, the MAS will underwrite the cost of the advisory costs to pay to make it green. I think these are very practical steps, and we are also building capacity. To do ESG properly, we have to have trained people who understand not only environment, but understand banking and as a business. So I think these were some of the other steps taken. We're creating capacity. We are also repricing energy in Singapore. We're introducing a carbon tax. a relatively low tax, but enough to push people to recognize that in future, energy prices will get higher and higher. Efficiency, productivity must be part of that. So similarly, we price water and other inputs of resources at market, and we are adopting solar power much more. So we're basically re-gearing our economy to be sustainable. After we have a green economy, I think we can have more of a green financial system. Please allow me to stop there. I understand there'll be a second round, and I'll deal with some of the more detailed questions in a while. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kun Simon, about the sharing the green finance, with the green microphone over there. Huh? Anyway, in the next round, I might ask you about, after having taken some of the further steps, how was your real experience and how to push forward into the future? And now I would like to turn to Kun Vivek, who is from IFC, and people think that, well, financial institutions is able in order to do something in preserving environment. In terms of execution of the IFC, what IFC come up with, what kind of innovations or initiatives that you come up in order to ensure that your lending will be a green one?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much, and a big thank you to the Bank of Thailand for having me here. One of my colleagues a few months ago called me a green bond salesman. So I said, what better opportunity as a green bond salesman than to address regulators and some of the senior-most bankers in a country and try and convince them to issue green bonds. But I'll just touch upon some of the challenges before I get into execution. His Excellency, the Governor, talked about the floods in Bangkok. The cost of those floods, according to the World Bank, was almost $50 billion, and they impacted 13 million people. And the people they impacted most was not the middle-class people and the upper middle class sitting in this room, but the people they impacted most were people at the bottom of the pyramid who had probably just about got out of poverty and have gone back into poverty again. So we need to frame this whole issue with that. We also need to frame the issue as the air we breathe. And I think everyone talks about the fantastic job the Chinese have done. And I think one of the things that led them to do this was the healthcare costs. The cost of healthcare is going to grow up exponentially because of what's inside our lungs and because of what we breathe there. So I would want to just really even talk about, it's not about preserving the environment. It's actually about a good investment in our future, as a country, as a race, as humankind. So what has IFC been doing? We've been doing a number of things. I used to be the global head of risk when we did our first solar investment in India, which I am ashamed to say I opposed because I thought it will not make money. And when we did our first wind power plant in Brazil, and I opposed that as well. And the reason I opposed them was they were not viable. I was right in one case, I was wrong in the other case. So IFC has been a pioneer in investing in these sectors here. Which is renewable energy. And today, I think we're quite proud to say that in a number of countries like India, the cost of solar energy is actually lower than grid parity for coal. And I think Thailand is a great example of what can be done in the solar sector. But I think it's also important to recognize that the opportunity is beyond renewable energy. I would call it, how do we transition to a low carbon economy? And when people talk about building the BTS, which I saw happen when I was here in the early 90s, that is one example of which we need to recognize, because when you're able to take thousands, if not millions of people by train and not use individual cars, you're really cutting down a lot of pollution. When you're able to replace fuel-guzzling cars on the street and buses on the street with battery-operated cars, you're really talking about transitioning to a low-carbon economy. When you're able to replace plastic. So I think as a financier, we are trying to look at this space a little more holistically. And some of the things, the simple things that we can do are really, how do we convince governments as a start to come up with policies that encourage investments in these sectors? And one of the challenges this space has had about 20 years or 25 years ago was it was a CSR activity for a number of banks, for a number of companies. It was a do-good thing. Oh, I'm doing a bit of climate finance, which is really good. Pat me on the back, I go home. And that was very frustrating because I think that's what led to this space, a delay in the space taking off here. I think climate finance is good business. The business opportunity for the bankers in this room, they say between now and 2030, there will be a need for almost $25 trillion globally for investments in what I would call climate smart investments. So these would include things like agriculture. We don't talk about agriculture when we talk about climate, but agriculture is the most impacted, whether it's heat waves, which are happening today across the world, whether it's floods, whether it's degradation of soil, extensive use of fertilizers. So I think as financiers, we need to look at the space more holistically and can then come up with tailor-made solutions for each one of them. So as a start, like I said, we need the right policies from the governments to encourage investments in the space. But then on the other hand, there is this 23 or $24 trillion opportunity, and there's a lot of money waiting in the sidelines to come into this. And I think what we at IFC are trying to do is how do we channel just a little bit of that money into this space. So we're doing some really interesting things in places like Myanmar related to agriculture today. How do you reduce the use of fertilizers, optimize the use of water? So that's one area that we're very keen on focusing on, because that impacts a large part of the population of the globe. That impacts things like food security. And the other end of the spectrum is really renewable energy, which I think people have talked about, so I won't dwell more upon that. But I would want to finally link this business opportunity, which I think is for real, and it's good business, it's good money to be made, and the ability to attract this pool of capital which is sitting overseas into this. So I think in terms of implementation, that's how we'd like to look at it. And sometimes there is a need for a subsidy. And I think we shouldn't be ashamed to say that in order to kickstart a sector, we need a subsidy. And I think at the World Bank Group, we have a number of de-risking instruments and subsidies, what we call blended finance, in areas where you're not able to attract investment today, or in areas which may not be viable today because of scale, but will become viable as you expand the opportunity. So I think it's a combination of these factors that when it comes to implementation, clearly having good government policies, being very clear on the expected outcomes, and getting that pool of capital to come in. And let me end this by saying that every time I talk to a bank about, or a company about issuing a green bond, the first question I get is it going to be cheaper than a regular bond? And my immediate answer is no, it's not going to be cheaper. And I don't see why it should be cheaper. But there is a huge opportunity out there where this money can be channeled. So by doing this, what we're trying to do is help banks think through this opportunity as a great business opportunity. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kun Vivek. I mean, in the next round, I might ask you, when you mentioned about one of the initiatives, climate smart investments, I mean, is it difficult to convince those who will invest money in those projects? Because sometimes people might think, well, it's quite challenging. Well, let's turn the question to Kun Roger. I mean, Standard Chartered, who is one of the bank which embrace sustainability for sure. What kind of plannings or strategy or execution that you do in order to preserve environment from your point of view?
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Bank of Thailand for inviting us today to speak. I'm not a banker. I'm an engineer that works for a bank. I've spent the majority of my career in upstream oil and gas, and I have just joined the bank 3 years ago. 5 years before I joined the bank, I found myself in East Africa in Uganda, and we were there for oil exploration. Uganda being a landlocked country, it just so happened that oil was underneath a national wildlife reserve called the Murchison Falls National Park. It was like being on safari. We had lions, elephants, giraffes, hyenas, hippos, crocodiles. So when I first joined, I had to come to terms, I had to reconcile with myself as an individual, being an environmental professional, whether this was the right thing to do. And then my boss at the time said, well, if it isn't us, who else is it going to be? And we put all of our time, we put all of our effort, we went over and beyond what was required by law. what was required by the oil industry. We understood our environment. We went all out to undertake our work in a environmentally and socially acceptable manner. We wanted to behave and operate in a way where we had a license to operate, a social license to operate, to be accepted by not the government, by the communities we were working with. We did a good job, and later on, after joining the bank, I actually found out Standard Chartered financed us. And they were very aware of the work that we had done to monitor lion populations, for example. And it gave me a good sense of what financial institutions do. Before, I didn't think financial institutions were managing environmental social risk, and then after joining the bank, I came to realize that they were more involved than I ever thought before. And they look to companies to do the right thing. They look to finance good practice. And essentially that underpins the job that I do now. So, gamekeeper that I am in the bank now, I work in the environmental social risk management team, which has a dedicated resource to manage the environmental and social risks arising from our client relationships and transactions. This approach is consistent with the bank's intent to lead our way with our clients to improve the sustainability performance and differentiate ourselves to be a force for good. Our approach is to proactively engage with our clients to mitigate any impact that stems from our financing decisions. We believe that this creates a competitive advantage for our clients. It strengthens the long-term and develops long-term relationships with our clients and contributes to sustainable economic development in the communities within our footprint. This means that as an individual within this team, we develop the standards for the bank and the tools for our front-facing, client-facing staff to identify environmental social risks in their everyday job, to mitigate through developing solutions, and support our clients to improve their environmental and sustainable practices. So, the group's approach to sustainability over the past 20 years has followed a path of following, the global backdrop of the UN Millennium Development Goals, the Global Reporting Initiatives, the Kyoto Protocol, Montreal Protocol. And as this has moved along, our initial focus was on corporate social responsibility. And this is now followed up with the introduction of environmental social standards within the bank, which is now represented through our captured in our position statements, which I'll come to shortly. As time has gone on and implementing these standards and working with clients and looking at the impact, now what we're trying to do, this whole process has evolved into how do we articulate the positive impact that the bank is having for our core business and highlighted within our, the bank's sustainability aspirations. Standard Chartered, essentially our footprint is heavily impacted by sustainability-related challenges. 2/3 of the global population live within our fast-growing markets, and which face daily economic, environmental, and social trade-offs. So the response that tackles global sustainability priorities is to align our business strategy, competencies, and actions. And this requires a good resource from the group. So as you can see, we've moved along this graph. We've signed up to our own social and environmental policies. Signed up to the UN Global Compact, Equator Principles. Our brand and values campaign has come along with that. We have reissued our position statements, and I'm in the process now of reviewing and refreshing our policies. So as you can see, it's it takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. It evolves, and sustainability will continue to evolve. And so it's a journey, and it will be a journey for Standard Chartered in the future as we carry on, and our partner banks, and I guess that the finance industry as a whole. Our approach to sustainability, how we do business, focuses on 3 pillars: contributing to sustainable economic growth, being a responsible company, and investing in communities. So essentially what we're saying is, like, financing projects, contribute to economic growth. We do that through providing jobs on a project or providing supporting infrastructure that will support development. However, companies need to get this right. So they see managing environmental social risk as a positive impact to their bottom line. Personally, I see sustainability practice does 3 things. It encourages more investment. Ethical investment is now becoming the norm. Pension companies such as BlackRock are a good example of this, and most large international investors expect to see good practice embedded in business behaviors. Secondly, good sustainability practice is reflected in share price. Examples of this are plummeting share price when there is an environmental accident, pipelines being shut down because of community protests, oil spills, palm oil companies losing customers when they're investigated by their regulators. And then thirdly, reputation. This affects the above 2. This affects investment and it affects share price. But there's no point giving, in terms of people in jobs, giving people's jobs and economic development if at the same time you make their lives off worse in terms of quality of life and polluting the air that they breathe, the water that they need, and then compromising their ability to draw off their natural resources. So to essentially improve people's lives, you need to get all of these 3 elements working together. You need a good balance. So the next step is, how do we implement? What do we do? I've mentioned the position statements before. These help us maintain environmental social standards. They outline how we do business in each of the sectors that we're in. And we have identified mainly the sensitive sectors. And these include agribusiness, the extractives, power generation, chemicals in manufacturing, infrastructure and transport. And these are then further underpinned by our overarching principles. And this includes water, human rights, climate change, and modern slavery. So basically, in each of these, we articulate what we consider as a bank as best practice. We draw from global standards such as the IFC and the IFC performance standards as a minimum requirement that we would apply to any financing. And then we build on top of that. We try to aspire to best practice. And so by doing so, we ask each other, on a daily basis, I ask 2 questions of myself. How are our partners, our clients, aligned to the core values of the bank, which are articulated for our position statement? And how do we ensure our finances are sustainable? As an engineer, I have to measure everything. I need to know that we're not just saying something and not following through on it. And so, as part of our team, that is our core effort, is to ensure that our position statements are implemented, that our clients are complying with that, and we are having a tangible benefit impact. So, at the end of the day, I fundamentally believe that good economics goes hand in hand with good environmental and social behaviors. Applying our criteria, how do we apply our position statements on a daily basis? We look for three things. I'm not going to talk through this too much, but it's number one is commitment. Commitment that our clients are committed to managing the risks in alignment with our standards. The second, in terms of a transaction of project finance, the capacity to make sure that there are clear mechanisms in place to achieve these commitments. And then thirdly, we need to monitor. It's not just good enough to go and to do an assessment and then provide the financing, but what happens after that money is given? How do we ensure that our position statements are complied with, that the standards are upheld? We'll need to monitor. And so we'll monitor through a number of different ways. We'll look at track record, for example. We'll go to site, we'll go and see that ourselves to ensure that the client's track record is still, in line with regulators, media, and society. It's consistent with that. So our impact, helping create the frameworks which drives sustainable finance. I do one small part of that. And what have we done? We've become signatories to the Equator Principles since 2003, a member of the Banking Environment Initiative since 2014. We're a member for drafting the Green Loans Principles, signatory to the Green Bonds Principles, the Climate Bonds Initiative, and we've been a member of the United Nations Finance Initiative since 2002. Here's a list of some of the transactions which are aligned to these frameworks. But I guess going into the future now, it's not looking at so much the negatives, whereas once before the bank talks about deforestation, now I want to start talking about reforestation. Then on a closing note, Standard Chartered have all of these standards. But we are pro-business, but not at any cost. It only makes sense to us to undertake business that meets our standards and complies with our requirements. So why banking? Because I've worked in different sectors, I firmly believe that banks and investors have the greatest opportunity to promote sustainable business. By only investing in companies that have strong environmental and social safeguards and understand the value of mitigating their impacts, we are in a unique position to shape the future where companies operating ethically with respect for people and the environment are the ones that thrive and expand at the expense of those who don't take these issues seriously. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having shared with us the way you think. But however, in the next round, I might ask you, in case that you face some dilemma, some of the company might not be as green as you expected in your parameters, how will you react to that dilemma? But I turn to Kun Bantun. After the first round, now I wish to learn more about the examples of your execution and implementation from Kasikorn Bank.
A case study is a national forest. Could you slides? 3 pictures you can move them around and so people take a look. This is the largest and first-class headwater national forest of Thailand that distills and filters 40% of the water mass that becomes the Chao River that runs by the bank of Thailand here. And over the past 10 years, we have lost 28% of this national forest. First question to ask is that how did the state, not any particular one, how the state, which is the accountable party, allow this to develop to this point? How can you lose 28% of first-class mountainous national forests and still have no solution? From the financial banking point of view, this is only a small element. You can ask the questions whether the banks why are you lending to the agribusiness giants that in a way, buy the produce, which is mostly corn, animal feeds, for animal feeds. Buy corn from this, and indirectly condoning this, the destruction of the national forest. You can ask that questions, and you never pin down anybody, because you never know which part of the money goes into buying corn, because these are all huge agribusiness conglomerates. And you can say, how did your farmers finance themselves? Where do you get the money from? Certainly not from the private banks. They're not credit-worthy enough. They get from the state banks, and they never pay back. They are not able to pay back because they're not making any money growing corn or low-class kind of sort of plants. But in the end, we're stuck here as a country that is unable to manage the destruction of this first-class natural resource, I mean, the forest. Now, I think this goes beyond just banking. All the banking and financial policy in the end will come around to be a part of the solution if we can find one. But to the credit of this current government, they own up to this failure on the part of the state, and they own up to by in a way admitting that the state authorities alone, they cannot address this issue successfully. I've been mandated by the government to co-chair the first ever public-private task force to treat the entire forest here of Nan Province. Nan Province, most people, our visitors here, is a northern province in the same latitude as Chiang Mai, a little bit towards the east, bordering Laos. But it is an important natural resource for Thailand, and it's become more and more known now for that reason, for its destruction. So this public-private task force is charged with finding a solution, hopefully a complete solution to not only to put the stay on the destruction, but also to gain back the national forest. Of course, 28% the people working on that. It's not just open land that you can go back and replant the trees. It has to do with how to get the people to earn enough of a living to be able to live and hopefully replanted forest. I've been working on this with the state authorities, and we're almost to the point where I can go back and pitch my case to the government, the Prime Minister in particular. And I would just say that the solution is not a simple one. It's a very complex, multifaceted approach that will take many parties to, not political parties, many parties to make it into a reality. But for the time being, to ask the question, where does the Kasikorn Bank comes to do this? The Kasikorn Bank doesn't lend here. We don't dare lend here. You don't get the money back, but they support me with the resources to go work on this problem. So this is something that intrigues me as a person personally, and also has become something that my board of directors will have to listen to report every month, whether they like it or not. So I talk about this every time. So it become part of the pulse, the social responsibility pulse of Kasikorn Bank. So this is something that is still in the process of finding a solution. It has to involve negotiating with the entire population of the national, the people who are on there, on this national forest ground. So it is something, a different experience, but it takes the knowledge of how to work both with the government and how to work the capital markets, the capitalistic market that has to, in the end, we have to come together to make sure that the people find a sustainable way of making a living, and the forest can be replanted back.
Well, thank you very much for having shared with us such an inspiring story from this. I mean, this story really inspires many people here in Thailand as well. Well, now let's turn to Kun Simon. I mean, once you mentioned in the first round that in comparison to, for example, European banks, they are greener, they are really avant-garde. But Singapore's already takes some steps already. I mean, after having implemented, for example, incentive or taxation issues, I mean, how have you experienced with the very first step? I mean, what needs to be done a little further into the mid-range future?
Well, thank you for that question. I think particularly with the Bank of Thailand taking this initiative, we are all at some sort of start of a journey. When we decided this in Singapore, we realized that we needed a space to speak among the banks, the investors, and not just the banks, other financial institutions, the insurance companies, others, etc. And of course, the non-government organizations. I think these have expectations about environment or governance issues, which need to be brought to the table. So it was my institute, the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, which brought together a collaborative initiative. We held a series of meetings, over 120 participants from the FIs, from the government, from the investing community and NGOs to really discuss this. And one of the key things we found is that we had to respect that different people were at different positions. As I mentioned, the European banks are far ahead. Even among the Singaporean local banks, some had started to move because of sometimes the CEO has a personal interest and passion about this issue. Others were more reluctant because of their customers. You know, like many Thai banks, I imagine, Singapore banks also, we lend to palm oil companies, which are accused of deforestation, power projects, which people question mark. How do we think about it? You know, if we want to be suddenly green, do we persuade our customers or we lose a lot of customers and we just go to another bank? So I think these were some of the overall concerns. And that's why we really had to respect that it makes only sense to move to environment when the middle of the market can move, and as I mentioned, capacity building. If I could have the next slide. Our report, therefore, came to some very, I think, starting, one of them is that the government itself must clearly signal the intent to shift the economy, which I mentioned the carbon pricing, the resource pricing, and I think Kumbanton also is correct that some things only governments can do. If they don't do this, then the market will not respond because there's no clear policy direction. Second is that we see that there are some leading institutions and we must recognize them and to encourage the majority to start to move along. The investors, for example, in the insurance sector, etc., the need to think about sustainability, disclosures in terms of their risk in their own business. I think these are all steps which are, frankly, still being taken in Europe. They're not completed their journey either, and some of what we felt we had to recommend. For the banking sector as a whole, if I could have the last slide I have, is that we felt the key findings. Can I have the next slide? Yeah. The key findings was that the Association of Banks of Singapore, as the professional industry sector, has started to issue their own guidelines and do their own training with the help of the well-known NGO, WWF, World Wildlife Fund for Nature. So we, in a way, help to encourage or we're very happy to see collaboration between the private sector and the NGOs. And then, of course, Mr. Charles also spoke about that. And I think in this sense, we have to create the condition for many partnerships to evolve. Now, if you look at the green bond standard for ASEAN and even our own ABS guidelines for responsible financing, you see elements of the international standard, which I talked about, but there must be some customization for the more regional and domestic concerns. I think the goal is not to just set a ridiculously perfect but unachievable standard, but really to nudge people along. And I think one of the nudges then is that the Central Bank of Singapore, from this year onward, will start looking at the banks, their own sustainability practices. Because otherwise, banks also ask, well, we maybe move along to make some opportunity, but if it's not part of what the supervisor cares about, why should we move fast enough? So those are some of, I think, the key findings we've found that how to encourage people to move.
Well, thank you very much, Kun Simon, for having shared with us. And now let's turn to Kun Vivek. I mean, you mentioned about one of the initiatives by the IFC, the climate smart investment. But of course, in order to do that, you need to convince people. I mean, after you have introduced this particular project, as well as some other project which is of similar nature, I mean, what are challenges have you found in convincing people to turn their target into something more sustainable or greener?
So I think, to put it bluntly, the biggest challenge is to convince people that it's profitable. And it's easier said than done. And I think we are seeing a significant shift now happening. So I'll share with you, Kun Bantun talked about the deforestation. And how do you convince companies that they should be able to trace their products, what we call traceability? And there are good solutions out there today. And I am going to talk a little about the use of technology. So with blockchain today, you can actually pick up this bottle of water and it will tell you where the water came from, which stream, where the plastic came from, and hopefully one day how the plastic will be, I don't know what they're going to do with all the plastic. But I do, degraded. So there are solutions today, and it's about always having one company. So a lot of companies have taken that initiative, that everything we produce, we want to be able to trace the supply chain and the traceability. And that can be done with technology today. So that's one thing. The other thing is really to be able to make a business case with clients that this makes business sense, and show them how it's been done sometimes in other parts of the world, and how this was going to actually, in the long run, be good for their business. And there's no doubt in my mind that, as was mentioned earlier by Roger, that stock prices do go upwards with companies that have a well-managed sustainability framework. So that's one. The second thing I'll touch upon is really so that's the positive. Now let's look at the negative. I think Kun Bantun talked about risk management. How many bankers today look at a project and say, what can go wrong in this project because of the environment? Financing a coal-fired power plant today, will it exist 20 years from now, given that solar prices are collapsing or coming down rapidly, given that technology investments in battery technologies or storage technologies is going up, so you're going to have a paradigm shift, given that off-grid solutions are going to be a lot more viable. So do we look at it from a risk management perspective or not? So that's the second one, I would say. And then it's really about identifying and putting our heads together on what makes sense, really. Like I said, climate smart investments are not just renewable energy. There's a lot of energy efficiency. One of my former bosses used to make fun of me because we had a project in China which actually entailed changing light bulbs. And he said, what the hell are you doing? You're financing changing of light bulbs. But today you have technologies where changing a light bulb is going to result in significantly lower power consumption. So I talked about climate smart agri, and that's going to be a big challenge, I think, because that's really getting down to the farmers, and how do you do that? So sometimes maybe you're going to have to need some sort of cooperative approach for that. And lastly, I want to end to talk about two initiatives that IFC has started many moons ago. One is the Equator Principles. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because that's really to bring everybody on the same playing field. Because if you have one bank that's willing to go out and do things that are not conducive to preserving the environment, it's not going to be good for the rest of them either. And the second is an initiative that we started in 2012 with a number of other central bankers called the SBN, which is the Sustainable Banking Network, where we've gotten together a bunch of central banks, banking associations, and practitioners, where they not only share, so they share knowledge, they discuss the innovations that are happening, and they also discuss how do you manage project by project risks in this space here. So I would really hope that we can convince the Bank of Thailand to join the SBN soon. So I just want to end by saying again, the challenge is really how do we convince people that this is climate smart business is actually profitable, viable, good for the shareholders in the long run, and therefore good for the population at large. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, before I ask Khun Roger the last questions, I wish to remind you that the sessions afterwards will be followed by questions and answer. And therefore, should there be any questions from the floor, either you write down on a piece of paper or you prepare your questions and you have the microphone to communicate that. And now I wish to talk to probably the only engineer on the stage here. I like talking with engineers. On the one side, you have profitability. On the other turn, you have sustainability. In case you find the dilemma and you find the customers whose project is not as green as your parameters requires, what do you do?
So I guess going back to the story that I said in the beginning with many Standard Chartered's markets are already experience major environmental social challenges today. So we're not going to get away from that. It's there, it's a reality. So as a bank with our standards, it's very easy for us to say that project or that country has lower standards, it's not going to meet our requirements. It's so much easier just to walk away and leave it. And what does that leave? What happens after that? It's very much the same case as palm oil. The big international banks walked out with standards and they left the local banks who haven't developed their standards yet. It leaves a big gap. So rather than walking away, the bank has a position of where it's our brand promise, it's here for good. And here for good means let's not walk away, let's work with our clients, build on these relationships, and find solutions. Sustainability it's a complex issue, and it's a game in a way where sometimes you have to find that solution, and that's what Standard Chartered really want to focus on. So it's rather than leaving that hole, we want to stay in there for the long term. And if it doesn't look good today, it will look good tomorrow. We will keep on working at it. We've got examples of this. Earlier this year, the bank came out with a video, and it's regarding our involvement in Bangladesh, in ship recycling in Bangladesh, which has a legacy of being environmentally, socially, safety, all of these issues. Standard Chartered have been there for 20 years. The reason why we wanted to stay in was to ensure that over time, that if our clients didn't meet our standards then, that we would work with them to bring them up to meet our standards. By doing so, we're raising the bar not only for our clients, but for the industries that they're working in the sectors, and as a sector as a whole within that country. And that is in essence our brand promise as being here for good.
Well, thank you very much. Well, that's the first part of the panel discussions, and now it will be the time for questions and answer. I don't know whether anyone have collected the questions from the floor, or else you can have the microphones to ask your questions.
My name is Paul Lert from iBank. I would like to hear Khun Bantun expand a little bit more on the restoration of the reserve forest, presumably in the Nan province. What role the bank could possibly play in this reforesting effort?
Sorry, not enough time. Bank's not no role at the moment. It has to be the state that has to deal with the issues of rearranging the land rights, which is in the middle of the national forest, which is a very tricky kind of a political and legal maneuvering. But we have a proposals. We will need some kind of green funding to get the farmers to go through the transition from the old kind of low-class agricultural products like corn or even rubber. All of them don't generate enough money for them to be sustainable. For that transition, we need some green funding, which is something that we have to execute. And it's something that the government is not, I don't think they have the experience to do so. As I said, this is a multi-party kind of a cooperation, state and the private sector, and the farmers themselves also have to adjust. So that's just a preview of the framework of the solution, but it will take a while to go through the details. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you, and I think that can Simon wish to share something as well.
Just 1 minute. I've not been to the reserve. I would love to go one day. But my point is more general, that it is important for the private sector to take a lead, but then expect the government will set the right policy conditions to bring stakeholders together. That's part of what the report we did suggests, that at the moment, there's a bit of like everyone's waiting for everybody else. So the investor may be interested in investing in a sustainable project, but there's not many projects or bonds available. The issuer may be interested, but he's not sure that there is an investor. And the government is saying, well, we wouldn't mind moving the direction, but can we move the market? So it is easy for a central bank to set regulations, but if you do it unrealistically, then the banks also cannot comply. This is why I think that we're at a stage where we must accept that sometimes the standards we set won't be perfect, but the idea is to start moving first. And once there's more momentum, then we can start to ratchet up. So we brought copies of our report. It's about Singapore and the region, not about Thailand, but we offer to those of you interested just this approach where to start the collaboration. If Kasikorn Bank is doing this, it's a very good step, I think, and to bring others to the table to discuss key issues. Thank you.
Well, thank you, good Simon. Last questions here from the floor. It's a paperless way of asking questions, yet with paper. Take pictures of the paper. To Mr. Simon Tay, could you suggest us how to align shareholders, board of directors, the management and employees to give concerning on sustainability? What is your lesson learned?
Well, I think Kun Veritai earlier said about the millennials. It's very true that the younger people, my son is 21, these people take on a very planetary view quite naturally, in between watching all the internet, etc., etc. So they're quite interesting generation, and part of that is they want this purpose, this belief. So I think a lot of companies find it useful to let the young people be energized, feel the ownership. Of course, they must be mentored, they must be given the space to dream big. For many companies, they watch their own footprint first, and that's the easy part, in a sense. What do you do with your office waste? What do you do with your, voluntary philanthropy and other funds? How does your own business align to, cutting waste and making more efficient? The difficulty for financial institutions is a bit, you have your own footprint, and then you have your customer's footprint. What is the ability to influence that secondary footprint? For authorities like the central bank, it's triple, because you have your ability to influence the banks, which then influence their customers. So that leverage can be used, but it is difficult. It's a much longer span of influence or control. So I think one can start with the young, but in the end, one has to think about policies and to try to really get beyond one or two, good examples. On the board level, I would say that, frankly, in Singapore, when the Singapore Exchange introduced sustainability, most directors were not interested, as I mentioned. They just thought this is another more paperwork, more tick the boxes. I think sometimes people on the boards are me or older, and so we struggle to understand this instinctively. We need to be taught. Even if we want to do this, if we don't know how to do ESG reporting, we don't know what it's for, we don't see it. And that's why I think that Kun Banton shared a very good point of view at the start, that risk and equity, the role of the corporate in the society, these are fundamental to get the real message across.
Well, thank you very much. I wish we had much more time discussing this issue, but unfortunately things is not so. Therefore, I would like to ask the floor for a big round of applause for our panelists.
Okay, thank you very much.